Chapter 17. Jake had really screwed himself, because he'd acted like a total idiot and shifted in a place that wasn't secure. He had a bullet in his shoulder. He'd never been shot before, and he would have loved to miss that special experience. He wasn't a fan of pain, and his shoulder ached like the very devil. Worse yet, he needed help. After bragging to Rachel about a worse ability to heal, he was faced with something he couldn't handle by himself. Closing the wound with the bullet still in his shoulder wasn't smart. Someone would have to take it out. Yeah, right. Someone. He only had one option within a radius of 100 miles, and he damned well knew it. Furthermore, he'd put himself in this pickle as a result of mismanaging his situation with her. How fitting that he'd have to swallow his pride and go crawling to her begging for her medical expertise. He wouldn't be required to crawl or beg though, and he knew that she would help without being asked. She was that kind of person, that kind of human. He admired the hell out of her. Resting on a bed of pine needles deep in the forest, he calculated the passage of time by watching the shadows. He wanted to give Rachel a chance to go home and ease Lionel gently out the door. That wouldn't be easy. The kid had appointed himself her protector. Jake couldn't blame him for firing that gun. He thought Rachel was in danger and had acted accordingly. In Lionel's place, Jake would have done the same. Only Jake could shoulder the blame literally for this fiasco. The saving grace, if there was one, might be Rachel's strong reaction to his shift. She'd expected roses and lollipops, and he disabused her of that fantasy today. Maybe now she'd give up her crazy idea that they should build a life together. Sharp longing made him groan aloud. Mental pain could rival the ache of a bullet buried in his flesh. But no matter how much he craved the same thing she did, he couldn't let her know. Mating with her would be an act of pure selfishness. At last he decided enough time had passed that he could chance sending her a message. That in itself was amazing. She'd taken it as a sign that they were destined for each other. He couldn't go along with that. But scientifically speaking, she was an unusual human. He knew several were scientists who would be excited to discover Rachel's ability to link telepathically with a werewolf. They would never get the chance to study the phenomenon though. That would mean revealing what he'd shared with her, and that wasn't going to happen. Shifting his weight on the pine needles, he focused his mind on Rachel, searching for her the way he might turn the dial of a radio looking for a station he wanted. There. The link seemed to light up a part of his brain, and he could see her as if she sat next to him. He sent her his question. Are you alone? Yes. How are you? He gave a little sigh of resignation. Admitting his weakness even to someone who wouldn't judge him wasn't easy. Jake? Are you badly hurt? Bullet lodged in my shoulder. Need you to take it out so I can heal. Oh my God. Are you mobile? I can come there. So much for her promise to Lionel. She'd break it if he needed her. He wasn't immune to that kind of unquestioning devotion. He would do the same for her if she ever needed him. No matter what happened, he'd carry the memory of her loyalty forever. He'd lose a lot of blood while making his way back to her, but he'd rather be in her cabin for the bullet removal and recovery period. I'll come to you. Watch for me by the back door. I'll be there. Be careful. Thanks. That warning comes a little late. I know. Just get here, Jake. Her concern reached across the distance between them. He rose from the blood-soaked bed of pine needles. Then he had another thought. Where's Lionel? If the kid showed up with a gun, Jake was too weak to outrun him. He promised not to search for you today. You have time to come to me. Thank you. He was amazed that she'd been able to keep Lionel from tracking him down. The kid's instincts were good. He sensed that Rachel was in some kind of danger from this wolf she'd been hanging out with, although he didn't understand the nature of the threat. Lionel was worried about a broken neck, not a broken heart. Jake thought about Lionel as he made his slow and painful way through the trees. He wondered if Rachel had considered Lionel when she dreamed up her plan to run off and live with the wolves. Lionel couldn't do that, so what did she imagine would become of him? He wasn't launched on a career of his own yet. He needed a boost from Rachel before that could happen. Obviously Rachel hadn't taken all the issues into account when she blithely announced that she was ready to mate with Jake. Her suggestion had been an impulse, and like so many impulses, it would be discarded when reality allowed her to see the impossibility of that dream. Still, the idea that she'd even have that thought was surprising. He'd assumed she wouldn't want to mate with a werewolf any more than he wanted to mate with human. He'd underestimated her ability to adapt to a changing situation. Her flexibility was far greater than his. But then she wasn't dealing with such high stakes. By choosing to mate with a she'd have some personal challenges, but she wouldn't be paving the way for a potential assault on her entire species. He would. Or at least that's how he saw it. The trip back to Rachel's cabin seemed 5 times longer than the hike out. But at last he saw her place through the trees. He paused and sniffed the air. He didn't smell anyone's scent but hers, but he wasn't at his best right now. He'd lean on that telepathic connection again. I'm close to your cabin. Are you still alone? Jake, thank God. Yes, I'm alone. Do you need help? No, I'll make it there under my own power. With one more check of the perimeter, he headed for her back deck. He'd never expected to climb these steps again as a wolf, yet here he was. She stood with the door open. Although she was in shadow, every line of her body communicated anguish. Oh, Jake. It's only a scratch. He couldn't resist acting like a hero from an old Western. That's what they all say. Once he was inside, she lapsed into regular speech. I've made up your bed like it was before. Go on in and lie down. Have water boiling. Tension eased out of him the moment he stepped into her cabin. He would be okay. Rachel would make sure of it. He could relax now and concentrate on recovering from this latest insanity. Padding over to the bed she created with her quilt was like coming home. He was careful about how he climbed onto it, though. He suspected last time he'd stained it with his blood. Sighing, he settled down on his right side, leaving his bloody left shoulder accessible. He didn't fool himself into thinking this would be a lot of fun. Digging out a bullet was a serious proposition. But his trust in Rachel was absolute, and, without a single reservation, he surrendered himself to her care. Her almond scent preceded her into the bedroom. I'm ready to do this, Jake. But I don't have any anesthetic. I know. I do, however, have a bottle of Grandpa Ike's wild turkey. Jake considered that might work. I don't want to give you anything that will cause you more harm. Can a werewolf drink alcohol? Absolutely. Remember that I'm not really a wolf. All right. Then let's try a little painkiller. Crouching by his head, she poured a generous amount of wild turkey into a bowl. Lap it up. Easing to his stomach, he tasted the booze and choked. Maybe not. She started to take the bowl away. He put a paw on her arm to keep her from doing that. The stuff was strong, but he needed strong. Steeling himself against the bite of the whiskey, he drank the entire bowl. It burned all the way down his throat to his gut. But then, the alcohol hit his brain and he ceased to give a shit about anything. Rachel sat back on her heels. Wow, I've never seen a drunk wolf before. Take a good look, little lady. Little lady? Jake, are you channeling some rhinestone cowboy? Rhinestone cowboys don't get shot. I took a bullet. Show some respect. But the pain of the bullet had receded with every lap of the wild turkey, and now it was a dull ache that he could easily ignore. You did take a bullet, Jake. Her voice was soothing as she bathed his wound with warm water. A lovely voice. He hadn't appreciated how melodious that voice was until now. Melodious. Good word. He should remember it. Perfect description of Rachel's voice. Well, Jake, from the way you're lying there as if you didn't have a care in the world, I'm going to assume the wild turkey has done its work. So now I'll do mine. But the wild turkey aside, this is going to pinch a bit. Jake remained in his don't give a shit daze until searing pain ruined it. He howled. I know. It hurts. She continued to work. Hurts? That's like saying the Grand Canyon's a ditch. He howled again. Louder this time. Hang in there, buddy. She sounded as if she might be gritting her teeth as she said that. He had a choice of gritting his teeth like a hero or howling like a wuss. He'd lapped up a bowl of wild turkey. He howled. Almost got it. She swore. There. It's out. Jake howled some more just because he could. I suppose now you can do your thing. Shift and make yourself better. He thought about that possibility, even tried to work up the energy. Can't. Why not? Just realized. Can't shift while plastered. Oh, well, I guess it's a trade-off. Without the wild turkey you would have suffered more. I'll apply a compression bandage for a while. You can shift later on. Yeah, I'll shift later. Don't shave me. I won't. She chuckled. Thanks. He winced when she first pressed the gauze pad to his wound, but then it wasn't so bad, especially when she began stroking his fur with her other hand. Relieved that the bullet was out, he relaxed against the soft quilt. The booze was still working on him, thank God, so the pain was bearable. That combined with her gentle touch made him drowsy. Maybe I'll sleep now. That's a great idea, Jake. Sleep will help you heal faster too. It's been a tough day. No kidding. Hey Rachel, just so you know. His fuzzy brain had trouble forming a coherent sentence. You appreciate what I did. I know you do, but Jake, I'm the one who got you into this bad situation. If you hadn't felt compelled to shift right then, because of what I'd said, you wouldn't have been shot. Don't blame yourself. My fault. Okay, then we share the blame, but you're the one who took the bullet. Gee. Caressed his ruff. I did, didn't I? He couldn't help feeling proud of that. You're very brave, Jake. She continued to stroke him. You too, Rachel. In fact, I'm beginning to think he lost his train of thought, which was too bad because he sensed it was important. You're what? She leaned forward, as if that would encourage him to finish the sentence. But he couldn't finish it. Exhaustion and booze claimed him. He fell asleep, with the delicious sensation of her hand moving over his fur. Rachel sat beside Jake for a long time. Normally she would have bandaged a wound like this, but she'd promised not to shave him, and besides she wasn't sure what would happen if he woke up and wanted to shift. Could cause major problems. So she held the pressure bandage in place. Eventually the bleeding stopped and she set the bandage aside, although she continued to stroke his fur. It felt so incredibly soft under her fingertips, and she doubted he would have allowed her to pet him under normal circumstances. He would bristle at the idea of being treated like a dog. But now he was injured, drunk, and fast asleep. The last time he'd been in her bedroom, which seemed like years ago, she'd thought he was a semi-tame wolf. That still wasn't a bad description of Jake, part man, part wolf, all male. In a few short hours of fabulous lovemaking, he'd ruined her for anyone else. Nice job, Jake. Well, it wasn't over till it was over. She hadn't given up on her campaign to change his rigid beliefs. But if that proved impossible, she was pretty sure she'd be losing the love of her life. Unless he could see that, though, they were both doomed to settle for second best. What a shame. As her own weariness made her yawn, she decided to grab a pillow and blanket, so she could sleep on the floor next to her patient. That way she could be aware if he moved. Moving could make the bleeding start again. First she tidied up the area and carried everything except some extra gauze pads into the bathroom. Then she changed into a tank top and PJ bottoms so she'd be more comfortable. Jake didn't stir. She wasn't surprised. She hadn't slept much the night before, and he hadn't slept more than an hour or two at most. Now that she was up, she felt hungry. Worry over Jake had stolen her appetite earlier, but now she wanted a candy bar. Perfect. Maybe 2 candy bars. Lionel would have a fit if he knew. Not only was she harboring the wolf, she was compounding her foolishness by snacking on sugar. She walked around lowering all the blinds in the house while she ate the first candy bar. No sense in giving anyone, especially Lionel, a peek into what was going on in her little cabin in the middle of the afternoon. He probably wouldn't bother her though, because he thought she was having a hot love affair. He'd blushed when she'd mentioned wanting to catch up on her sleep today. Then he'd asked if Jake would be by later, and she'd said he might. Sure enough, he had come by and was currently in her bedroom recovering from the bullet Lionel had pumped into him. The poor kid had thought he was saving her life, and she couldn't blame him for that. But she couldn't let him see the wolf again under any circumstances. As far as Lionel would ever know, that wolf had lit out for the tundra. Lionel obviously didn't like Jake the man either. He believed Jake had been careless in his guardianship of the wolf, which meant he wasn't the guy for Rachel. Lionel hadn't looked happy to hear that Jake might spend the night at her house, but at least the prospect of that would keep Lionel away until morning. As she folded a blanket and laid it next to Jake, she leaned down to inspect his wound. Still looked okay. He whined in his sleep and his legs twitched, but that didn't cause him to bleed, so maybe he'd be fine until he recovered from his drinking binge and could shift. Plopping the pillow down, she stretched out on her back and unwrapped the second candy bar. As she ate it and listened to Jake breathe, she felt calm. Trail. She was gradually becoming used to the idea that her lover was sometimes a big black wolf. Then again, he might not be her lover anymore. Maybe by trying to convince him that they should consider mating, she'd made him too wary of her. He needed her now, but once he healed, he had no reason to stay. Well, except the biggest reason of all, they belonged together. He wouldn't have to stick around to monitor her behavior and make sure she didn't leak werewolf info. After this incident, he couldn't doubt her trustworthiness. And his days of running through the woods of Polecat were over. Everything pointed to Jake Hunter selling his cabin and moving somewhere else. Where would that leave her? She had no answer for that, but at least Jake was okay. That was the main thing. As she drifted off to sleep, she thought about all the wild turkey he'd lapped up and wondered if werewolves had hangovers. Sometime later, she got her answer when he began to groan and whimper as if he would die any minute. She leaped up and crouched next to him, her heart pounding. Is it your shoulder? No, it's my head. Evil gnomes with hammers and chisels are excavating my skull. She pressed her lips together so she wouldn't laugh. He wouldn't appreciate that. You have a hangover, Jake. This is no hangover. I've had hangovers and this is way worse. My brain is bleeding. Wild turkey packs a punch. Maybe if you tried to shift, you'd feel. What if I shift and my head explodes? What about that? How do you know? When was the last time you shifted? Never, but I recognize the symptoms of a hangover, even in a werewolf. Thought shifting might help. Can't shift. The top of my head would come off. She gave up arguing the point. Do you want to try and swallow some ibuprofen? I guess. Rachel, my head really hurts. I mean, really. I'm sure it does. She kept her smile to herself, but he was pretty funny. Her big bad wolf, who'd fought a bear and survived being shot, had been brought low by a bottle of wild turkey. I'll get you some ibuprofen and an ice pack for your head. Don't thrash around while I'm gone or you'll start bleeding again. Okay. In the kitchen cupboard, she searched around and finally found what she was looking for. Grandpa Ike had loved his wild turkey, and on some mornings he'd needed an ice pack. He had the old-fashioned kind, a soft-sided bag that unscrewed from the top. She filled it with ice, ran a bowl full of water, and carried both into her bathroom, where she picked up the bottle of ibuprofen. Armed with her hangover remedies, she returned to kneel beside Jake, who continued to moan. I need you to lift your head so I can put the pills into the back of your mouth. Don't want to. Come on. You'll feel better once you get these down. With another anguished groan, he lifted his broad head and opened his mouth. She set 2 pills on the back of his tongue. Now swallow. I have water here to help wash them down. He closed his jaws and gave her a baleful glare. Those damn gnomes are trying to kill me. I know. Swallow. His eyes closed and his throat moved. Good. Now drink a little water. Moving very slowly, he lowered his head to the bowl and took a couple of laps. That's plenty. He sank back onto the quilt. Now hold still. Let me position the ice pack. She settled it between his ears. How's that? He sighed. A little better. Good. She picked up the bowl of water and left quickly, afraid she'd start laughing any minute. Oh, for a camera, although he'd be horrified if she tried to take his picture. She'd never be able to show the picture to anyone, though. Maybe she didn't need a camera after all. As she told Lionel, she had a good memory. The image of her scary werewolf lying on her flowered quilt with Grandpa Ike's old-fashioned ice pack on his head would stay with her forever. Chapter 19. Rachel missed Jake the minute she drove away from her cabin. She'd have to get over this intense desire to be with him, or at the very least to maintain contact, because she wouldn't be able to for much longer. But she'd left him her cell number and had insisted on digging his phone out of her backpack and turning it on. Knowing she could call him or vice versa gave her comfort for the time being. She had 2 errands to run: clothes for Jake at his house and a pound of coffee at the general store. She hadn't told Jake about the coffee because he might have objected to her making contact with Ted, but she wouldn't take long, and she just had time to drop by the store before Ted closed up for the night. She was almost out of coffee, and a day without caffeine wouldn't work for her, especially considering the stress she was under. She'd meant to pick up a pound a week ago, but she'd been distracted by a sexy werewolf. Jake was in charge of cooking dinner while she was gone. He'd do a far better job of it than she would. When she'd left him in her kitchen, he'd been whistling as he concocted a barbecue sauce for the ribs she'd taken out of the freezer and stuck in the microwave. She had to admit he did a lot for the decor of her kitchen, although he'd chosen not to be completely naked while he worked in there. He'd said that sharp knives and hot liquids made him nervous about his family jewels, so he'd protected his privates with a towel slung loosely around his hips. With his dark hair and ripped body, he'd looked like a primitive warrior wearing a loin cloth. The faint red marks from the bear's claws and his bullet wound only made him look more manly, and bonus he could cook. Yes, she wanted him. She'd run through all the reasons why she shouldn't want him, and none of them amounted to a hill of beans. Because he trusted her, she could live the way she always had, except she'd have a man in her life, Jake. Pass for human all the time. Around her friends and family, he'd continue to do that. The issue of children had given her pause at first, but she believed that too. Parents who were devoted to each other were such a gift that a little thing like uncertain genetic patterns became unimportant. Her kids would never know anything different anyway, and they'd be loved no matter if they turned out human or were. She'd help them deal with whichever species designation they'd inherited. Sadly, she probably wouldn't get the chance because Jake wasn't buying what she was selling. She didn't delude herself on that score. Not anymore. He had every intention of walking out of her life forever. After that, he'd mate with some lucky werewolf and start his own pack. She'd seen how he'd lit up at that suggestion of hers. It was her idea, damn it. She'd hoped he'd make the obvious leap of faith and ask her to share that dream with him. But he hadn't. There'd been a moment there, a millisecond of optimism when something in his expression had told her he was thinking about it. In the end, he'd rejected that possibility. As she drove around the lake to his cabin, she wondered whether she should simply hand him his clothes and tell him to hit the road. He could take a doggy bag full of the food he'd cooked, or a wolfie bag, if she hadn't changed his mind by now, after she'd taken care of his wounded self twice and they'd enjoyed stellar sex many times. Chances were she wasn't going to change. Would keeping him around longer, knowing she couldn't win, make the end more devastating? Maybe, but she'd also have more memories to warm her on cold winter nights. Those memories would make finding a replacement for him extremely difficult, though. She couldn't do much about that. She'd had the best and was now stuck with the rest. The parking lot of the Polecat General Store was empty except for Ted's truck and a late-model SUV with, of all things, Idaho plates. The dusty, mud-spattered vehicle had obviously traveled the Alaskan highway to get here. Rachel hesitated before pulling in, but she really needed that coffee. She'd be okay unless the visitors could ID her on site. Some could do that, because she'd been featured on a few news shows in the lower 48. Reaching for the faded navy baseball cap she kept tucked behind her visor, she shook it out, put it on, and pulled her hair through the opening and back. Without makeup and wearing old clothes, she didn't look much like the internationally famous wood carver from Alaska's interior. The baseball cap finished off what she hoped was a successful disguise. Opening the screen door, she set off the jangling bells that Ted had hung there as a cheap alert system. Ted was behind the counter talking to an attractive middle-aged couple. They were both tall and athletic-looking with good bone structure. Rachel had been in contact with enough wealthy people in her new career to recognize that these folks had money. That could mean they were collectors searching for her, although they seemed harmless enough she couldn't trust them not to brag to others and give away her exact location. Tugging her baseball cap lower, she headed down the aisle toward the coffee. Ted wouldn't announce her presence, and she could wait until they left to approach the counter and pay. Then Ted called her name. "Hey, Rachel." She froze in place. What in the hell was Ted doing identifying her like that? Cautiously she turned around. These folks are looking for Jake. Ted gave her a reassuring smile as if to say that all was well. The visitors didn't want her after all. Oh. Alarms went off in her head. Idaho. They knew his folks and wanted to stop and say hello, but they didn't find him at home. I thought you might have some idea where he is. Weren't you two going hiking today? Yeah. She thought fast as she tried not to stare at what had to be a mated pair of werewolves. And they looked so completely normal too. But then, so did Jake. Jake, hurt himself on the trail, so he's over at my place. She could feel the couple studying her. They knew she wasn't where Jake had said werewolves could smell the difference. I hope it's nothing serious, the woman said. But this visitor wasn't a woman, Rachel reminded herself. She was a female. Werewolf. Rachel began to sweat. No, not too bad. Took a fall, has a bit of a sprain, but he'll be fine. How long are you here for? We're staying at a place about an hour back down the road, the male said. We tried to call his cell, but it just went to voicemail, so we thought it would be fun to surprise him. They must have tried to call while Jake's phone had been turned off at the bottom of her backpack. I'm sure he'd love to see you. Rachel did her best to sound enthusiastic. God, she didn't want to get Jake in trouble. For all she knew, these two belonged to his anti-human mating group. Even if they weren't part of that group, they were certainly from his pack. They had to be wondering why he was laid up since he had the ability to heal himself through shifting. Maybe they assumed he was trapped with her, a human, and couldn't shift. But why not? She'd left him to go shopping, so by all rights he'd be fine when she returned. All this complication for a pound of coffee. If only she'd bought some last week. I don't think he's up to company tonight, she said. But tomorrow would probably work. Do you want to leave me your phone number so I can give it to him? The female hesitated. If you're sure he can't see us tonight, we can do that. It's been a long day for him. Now there was an understatement. Tomorrow would be much better. She sounded like a protective girlfriend and couldn't help that. She wasn't about to invite these werewolves to her house. Something about them gave her the creeps, and she hoped it wasn't a newly discovered prejudice. Then she realized that if anyone was displaying prejudice, it was these two werewolves. When they looked at her, there was no warmth. Apparently they judged her as unworthy simply because she was human. Unfortunately for them, she controlled access to Jake, and they'd come to see him. Then let me give you our information, the female said. Opening her designer purse, she pulled out a small notepad and a jeweled pen. I'll write our names down too. It's been years, the male said. But he'll remember who we are. I'm sure he will. Rachel took the slip of paper. Above the number, the female had written Ann and Bruce Hunter. Rachel could have predicted that the last name would be Hunter. Give him our best, the female said. We'll wait to hear from him. I'll be sure to. Have a good night. Thanks for stopping by. Ted called after them. Then he glanced at Rachel. Did I screw that up? They weren't looking for you, just Jake. And they seemed to know him really well. They had his address and cell phone number, so I thought. It's okay, Ted. Is he really hurt? Or are you two enjoying some alone time? Both. He did have a small accident, but he'll be right as rain in the morning. Especially if he shifted once more while she was running errands. But I guess you could say we hit it off better than I thought we would. Ted beamed. That's wonderful. Here I thought you two were destined to be bitter enemies. No, Rachel blew out a breath. Not enemies. Hey, I came in for coffee, so I should probably buy it so you can close up. Don't be silly. Take your time. His eyebrows rose. I'm a nosy old man, but if you're buying coffee, then I assume that he'll be staying over. Even though she'd known Ted for years and shouldn't care if he knew she was getting cozy with someone, her cheeks grew warm. Ah, no wonder you don't want those people barging in on your private evening. I'm glad you held them off. They're not people, Ted. They're shapeshifters. But she couldn't tell this sweet man that, not now and not ever. If she'd needed a demonstration of what her life would be like if she hooked up with Jake, she was in luck. And Bruce Hunter were testing her ability to deal with two different realities. She wasn't crazy about the maneuvering, but if the reward was Jake Hunter, who was presently preparing food in her kitchen wearing only a skimpy towel, she could deal. He, on the other hand, probably would be horrified to find out she'd had a conversation with Ann and Bruce of Idaho. Getting back to her cabin took on greater urgency. Let me get my coffee. Need more candy bars? Oh sure, why not? After grabbing a bag of fresh roasted coffee beans, she detoured past the candy aisle and scooped up several of her favorites. Chocolate was a known mood elevator, and she might require a little mood enhancer in the near future. Placing the coffee and candy on the counter, she dug in her purse for the small mesh bag she always carried for impulse buys. A random thought crossed her mind. She'd had several rounds of mind-blowing sex with Jake, but she didn't even know if he recycled. He'd said werewolves were protectors, so she figured he would include the earth under that umbrella. After all, a wolf couldn't run through the woods if Someone cut down all the trees. A wolf couldn't drink from a stream that had been polluted with chemicals. Being wild would seem to focus a creature on sustainability. But she didn't know that, and she was curious. She should make a list of all the questions she had so that she could ask them while there was still time. When Anne and Bruce came to call tomorrow, he'd want to distance himself from her. It might be the end of her acquaintance with Jake. Ted put her candy and coffee in the bag she handed him. Did you ever find out why Jake was so hell-bent on giving away that carving? Well, yes, she had. She gave Ted a piece of the truth. He's been attracted to me for a long time, but he didn't think we were right for each other. The carving was a reminder of me, and so he wanted it gone. That story would play nicely into their inevitable breakup. Jake's belief that they weren't right for each other would prove to be true. Huh. Ted rubbed a hand over his balding head. Guess he was wrong about that. She smiled at him. Time will tell. It's early days yet. She handed over the cash for her purchase. Good point. My advice: go slow. Margie and I met and decided to get married in a matter of weeks. We should have waited a while to make sure getting married was the right decision. Do you miss her, Ted? A hint of vulnerability shadowed his blue eyes. Even the glare from his thick glasses didn't hide it. Sometimes the winter nights can be long. Then for your sake, I hope a nice woman shows up one of these days, Ted. You deserve that. He laughed. That would be great, but I'm not counting on it. Takes a special kind of person to want to live in Polecat, Alaska. He gazed at her. Like you. And Jake, for that matter. I hope it works out for the two of you. Thanks. Her heart ached with the knowledge that her chances of that were slim to none. We'll see. Have a good night, Ted. Grabbing her bag, she left the store. She heard the lock click behind her. Ted would go home, but no one would be waiting. Maybe in a few days she'd suggest that she and Ted check out the internet dating scene together. Moments later, she parked in front of Jake's cabin. He told her the back slider was open as usual, so she walked around to the deck. This was where it had all started. The first time she'd set foot on this deck, she'd thought she was tracking Jake's pet wolf. Glancing around, she remembered the meal they'd shared sitting at his elevated table. That reminded her that she was extremely hungry and Jake was cooking another fabulous meal on the other side of the lake. Gazing across the water, she imagined him inside, the small towel flipping back and forth as he moved around her kitchen. So she was hungry for more than food. Opening his slider, she stepped into his living room, closed the glass door, and headed directly for his bedroom. Previously she'd rummaged through his house uninvited while she looked for clues, but this time she had permission to open drawers and closets. He'd given her instructions as to where everything was kept. She piled things on his bed and tried not to get wrapped up in the memories. The bed evoked chances were she wouldn't share this bed with him again, so she might as well shut down that train of thought. She chose two of everything, with the hope that he might stay more than another 24 hours. But she didn't really think that would happen now that Anne and Bruce were in the neighborhood. The timing of their visit couldn't have been worse from her standpoint, but she believed things happen for a reason. She'd have to go with it. Once she had everything gathered, she took his duffel bag from the closet and piled it all in there. Before they'd left this morning, he'd unpacked from his San Francisco trip, so the duffel was available. She started to zip it and paused. One more thing in this bedroom called to her. She wouldn't keep it, of course. But as long as she was transporting items from here to her cabin, she might as well include Duncan McDowell's book. Jake wouldn't appreciate her bringing it over, of course, but Duncan was on her side, and she would give anything to talk to him. After all, he'd converted Kate Stillman to the cause. Rachel wanted to know how he'd done it. Tucking the book into the bag and zipping it up, she was about to leave Jake's bedroom when her cell phone rang. When she answered, she found herself talking to Jake himself. Where are you? He sounded uneasy. Sitting on your bed in your bedroom. Why? You need to leave ASAP. I just checked my messages and damned if some old friends of my parents aren't headed to Polecat. What are the chances? I've met them. Oh boy. I stopped by the store for coffee and they were there asking Ted if he knew where you were. Naturally, because he thinks we're hanging out together these days, he turned to me for information. What did you say? She took a breath and rolled her shoulders. I did the best I could under the Circumstances, Jake. I'm sure you did. I'm sure you handled it well. But I need to know my lines. For when I talk with them. I said you've been laid up following a small accident on the hiking trail. A minor sprain. He greeted that with silence. I wanted to stall them off. I didn't want them coming to my house, Jake. Were they rude to you? Because if they were, I'll let them know that I don't appreciate. No, they weren't rude. I could tell they were a little suspicious of me, but they were polite. Unless they've changed, they're conservatives like my folks were. They probably suspect a relationship and don't approve of it. I think you're right. And it was weird, Jake. I'm not used to being judged as not good enough because of something I can't change. I'm sorry, Rachel. They probably are prejudiced against you for being human. And it's pretty obvious you and I have been spending quality time together. She sighed. I know you didn't want anyone in the werewolf community to know about us. I hope I haven't compromised you in some way. His warm chuckle soothed her. You've compromised me in every way possible. And I've loved it. Don't worry about them. I can smooth it over. I hope so. Are they members of your warm group? No. They're not activists. That's a relief. I imagine them ratting on you in for being involved with a human. I'll ask them not to. They're old friends, so I'm sure it'll be fine. Thanks. I feel a whole lot better about this. And the good news is I have coffee for breakfast. And clothes? I could use some clothes. I'm having a hell of a time keeping this towel on. And that's a problem? Her mood improved dramatically as she anticipated the evening they were about to have. The next day could be a real letdown, but until then she'd enjoy herself. You wouldn't be so cavalier if I ended up steaming something far more critical than the rice. No, I wouldn't. Take care of yourself. I'll be there soon. Good. The cabin is empty without you. Shit. I smell something burning. Gotta go. He disconnected. Rachel started to put her phone back in her purse, but it blinked, indicating a text. It was from Lionel. Heart-pounding, she opened it. Found clothes that look like Mr. Hunter's. Went by his place an hour ago and his truck was there, but he wasn't. Thought about it for a while. Suspect foul play. Headed for your cabin. She started to respond, but that would waste valuable time. She could call Jake, but that wouldn't really help matters either. Shoving the phone in her purse, she grabbed the duffel and left. She'd rather not imagine the scene if Lionel discovered a nearly naked Jake in her house. But explaining why his clothes were in the bushes and he was with Rachel would require some creative storytelling. She didn't know if her presence would help or hinder, but getting to the other side of the lake became a priority. Chapter 20. After Jake had steamed the rice, he decided to sauté it with some olive oil and spices he'd found in Rachel's cabinet. After getting that going, he'd unearthed his phone, retrieved the messages from Anne and Bruce, and called Rachel. He didn't know how he was going to spin his association with her, so Anne and Bruce wouldn't blab to the entire hunter pack that Jake, who railed against worse having sex with humans, was a hypocrite who'd done exactly that. But he didn't want Rachel to feel responsible. This lapse was his fault, not hers. He hoped that the hunters wouldn't make a big deal out of it, because they'd known his folks so well, maybe they'd let it go. But his conversation with Rachel had distracted him from his cooking long enough for the rice to burn and set off the smoke alarm. Grabbing the smoking pan, he put it in the sink where it hissed angrily and gave off a miserable stench. The smoke alarm continued to screech, so he opened the kitchen window to let out the smoke. So much for his famous cooking skills. Not 5 minutes later, someone pounded on the front door. Anybody in there? Jake recognized Lionel's voice and groaned. The kid meant well, but he was becoming a total pain in the ass. Miss M. More pounding. Miss M, if you're in there, your house is on fire. Jake stood in the kitchen in his towel, debating his next move. By now most of the smoke had cleared and the smoke alarm had stuttered to a stop. Maybe Lionel would just go away. Or not. The front door opened, and Jake belatedly realized Rachel wouldn't have thought to lock it behind her. And why would she? He was here and there was no crime in Polecat anyway. Miss M. Lionel called out again. Then he paused. Well, guess I'd better check things out, he muttered, obviously to himself. Could be serious. Lionel, I'm here. Left with no choice, Jake stepped out of the kitchen. Lionel's eyes got huge and then his face turned red. Hi there, Mr. Hunter. He looked everywhere but at Jake. Thought nobody was home. Miss M's truck is gone. She's running errands. Jake resisted the urge to clasp his hands in front of his groin, but then he might disturb the delicate balance of the towel. Oh. Lionel glanced toward the kitchen. So what's burning? I was sautéing some rice. I got distracted. Ah. Must be fixing dinner for you and Miss M. Lionel nodded and darted a quick glance at Jake. Yes. She's not here right now. I figured. I have your clothes. For a moment Jake was disoriented. Rachel was supposed to have his clothes. Why would Lionel have his? Oh, those clothes. He'd forgotten to ask Rachel what she'd done to keep Lionel from noticing them in the first place. They were sort of scattered under a bush out on the trail. I was afraid you'd been murdered or something, although I couldn't figure out why they'd take your clothes off and shove them under a bush. Well, obviously I'm fine. Jake scrambled for a reasonable explanation and came up empty. Yep. That's good. Lionel surveyed the room with great care, as if he'd never seen it before. I didn't know you were a nudist, Mr. Hunter. I'm in. Jake caught himself. Maybe that was as good a cover story as any. Once he left Polecat, it wouldn't matter whether word got out that Jake Hunter was a nudist. It's okay if you are, Lionel said. I think people can be anything they want. It's just that sometimes families take their kids out on those trails, and I don't know how it would work out if they came upon a naked man running through the woods. They might call the cops on their cell phone and then you could get arrested. Thanks for the warning. I'll keep that in mind. And the bad part is when you got arrested you'd be naked. Jake coughed to keep from laughing, and the towel trembled dangerously. That's true. I would be naked. Not the best way to be when you're hauled off to jail. I suppose not. Listen, not to change the subject or anything. Jake swallowed the laughter that kept bubbling up from his throat. Oh please. Do. I hate to tell you this, but sometime while he was being transported to the sanctuary, your wolf got out of his cage. Oh. Oh is right. Lionel took a deep breath. I checked the news and thank God there's no story about a wildlife transportation team being mauled by a black wolf, so maybe he just managed to slip out without hurting anyone. He's a very smart wolf. Well, I shot at him. Lionel's gaze moved away from Jake again. I'm sorry to have to tell you that because I'm sure you care about him, but he was ready to attack Miss M, and I think he would have if I hadn't shown up. I can guarantee that wolf wouldn't hurt a hair on her head. Huh. You didn't see what I saw. He was going after her. Jake couldn't argue with that. He'd been going after Rachel for some time now. Only not in the way Lionel thought. Lionel's glance skittered past Jake again. So do you want your clothes? Have them out in my truck. I didn't expect to see you here, or I would have brought them in with me. Lionel blushed again. I mean, it's obvious you don't want them now. You have this whole nudist thing going on. But they're nice clothes. A little dusty but nice. I'd like them back, Jake said. Thanks. All righty. Lionel swung his arms back and forth. I'll just go out and get them. He started toward the door right as Rachel came through it. Jake was relieved to see that she'd left his duffel in her truck. All she carried was her purse and a mesh bag containing what looked like coffee and candy bars. Hey Lionel. Setting her purse and mesh bag on an end table, she gave Lionel the biggest, fakest smile Jake had ever seen. Hi Miss M. I see you've been buying candy bars again. Well, yes I have. She looked over at Jake with a wide-eyed, innocent expression. I see Jake's been keeping you company while I was gone. How nice. Yeah. Lionel shoved his hands in his pockets. We've been having a conversation. I told him it was fine with me if he wants to be a nudist. Rachel coughed and ducked her head. When she looked up again, her eyes were swimming with tears of laughter. She swiped at them with the back of her hand. Lionel glanced at her, his brow puckered. Are you okay, Miss M? Yeah, fine. She nodded vigorously. Just swallowed wrong. You were saying about this nudist thing. I think Mr. Hunter needs to be careful out on the trail. He could get arrested. She cleared her throat. Well, that's good advice, don't you think? Jake. Excellent advice. Her eyes twinkled. Can't have a naked man running around scaring the kids. Exactly. Lionel smiled in triumph. That's what I told him. He peered at her. You're not a nudist, are you? Wait, I don't want to know the answer to that. If you are, don't tell me. I don't want that mental image. I'm not a nudist, Lionel. Phew. His shoulders sagged. That's good to hear. Well, I'll go get Mr. Hunter's clothes and... He glanced from Rachel to Jake. How about if I just leave them by the front door? You two probably want to be alone. Jake decided to put an end to this party. By the door would be great, Lionel. Thanks for picking them up for me. No prob. Lionel started out again but paused and turned around. About tomorrow morning. Come at your regular time, Rachel said. Jake has some friends in town and he'll be meeting them in the morning. I'll be out in the workshop as usual. That plan made sense, but Jake couldn't help feeling sad that he wouldn't be spending the morning with her. He'd come back after meeting with the Hunters, though, wouldn't he? Then I'll be here in the morning. Lionel hesitated, his manner suddenly shy. I have that piece of wood nearly carved. Should finish it up tonight. I could bring it over tomorrow if you want. Rachel gave him a genuine smile this time. I would love for you to do that. Can hardly wait to see it. Then I'll bring it. Lionel's natural good cheer had returned. He grinned at both of them. See you later. Head held high, he walked out the door. Rachel glanced at Jake and dissolved into laughter. A nudist. Jake gestured toward his towel-draped body. The guy finds my clothes under a bush and walks into the house while I'm wearing nothing but a towel. I thought it was a brilliant deduction on his part. I suppose so. She continued to chuckle. So you just agreed with his conclusion and let it go at that. I started to contradict him, but then I realized he'd handed me the only logical explanation, so I rolled with it. Better to be thought a nudist than a werewolf. There's that. Her gaze roved over him. You'd make a pretty impressive nudist, though. Thanks. Not my thing. As I've said, I was raised in a conservative household. Even our shifting was done in private. And yet, you stripped down in front of me in broad daylight. That seems out of character now that I think about it. Oh, it was. He walked over to her. But when I'm with you I get sort of wild and crazy, in case you hadn't noticed. I've noticed. She lifted her face to his. And I like that in a werewolf. Good. He cupped her face in both hands. Because I think it's about to happen again. His lips hovered over hers when a rap sounded at the door. Damn. I thought he was going to leave them and go away. Me too. The rap came again. Rachel sighed. Let me go see what he wants. He's only trying to be helpful. After all. I'll go check the ribs. They should be about done. Jake reluctantly let her go and walked into the kitchen. The towel started to fall and he knotted it more securely. Had he been the nudist Lionel thought he was, he would whip the towel off and discard it because the major part of the food preparation was over. But being a nudist was the last thing Jake would consider. The more he thought about his behavior on the trail, the more he marveled that Rachel could get under his skin and make him do something so uncharacteristic. He heard the front door open. Sure enough, it was Lionel. Sorry to bother you again, Miss M, but I forgot to ask if you've seen that wolf. I still don't trust it not to come back around here, and I don't think Mr. Hunter understands that it's a dangerous animal. He talks just like you. Like it's no problem. Rachel's reply was filled with kindness. I know you're worried, Lionel. Promise if I'm threatened by that wolf, I'll call you right away. Jake smiled. Instead of lying to the kid, she'd managed to dodge the question entirely. Nicely done. Make sure you do call me, Lionel said. Anyway, you might as well take the clothes since you're standing here. Thanks. Okay, now I really am leaving. Good night, Lionel. See you later, Miss M. The front door closed and Rachel approached the kitchen. I'm sure you heard all that with your super-duper ears. Jake walked out to meet her. I did. You handled it well. I left your clothes just inside the front door. They definitely need washing. Assuming the coast is clear, would you like me to bring in the duffel bag? Yes, please. And as much as I feel like ravishing you, I'm really hungry. And the food's ready. Then let me get your duffel so you can get dressed and we can have dinner. Her silver eyes held the promise of what was to come. No rush. We have all night. The way she said it almost made him reconsider having dinner first. But he hadn't eaten since breakfast, and he'd expended a lot of energy since then. While Rachel went out to her truck to grab the duffel bag, he went back into the kitchen for a bowl of salad he'd tossed earlier. As he located place settings and opened a bottle of red he'd found in her wine rack, he anticipated the pleasure of sharing another dinner with Rachel. Although he cooked for trekking clients out on the trail, he ate most of his meals at home by himself. He hadn't thought he'd mind it, but now that he'd experienced having Rachel around for this daily ritual, he'd miss her enthusiastic presence. By the time she returned with his duffel bag, he'd put all the food on the table and had even located a couple of candles and candlesticks. She laughed in obvious delight when she noticed the flickering tapers. I'd forgotten I had those. You don't eat by candlelight? It seems sort of silly if you're by yourself. She set down the duffel and glanced at him, especially in the summer when it's bright as day. I know, we don't really need the light, but I've always liked the look of candles. Werewolves are drawn to fire. She seemed intrigued by that idea. Do you eat by candlelight? Hey, do I strike you as the type of male who lights candles before diving into his solitary meal? I hope to hell not. Well, no. She grinned. That doesn't conjure a picture of a manly man or, in your case, a rugged werewolf. That's right. So the answer is no, I don't eat by candlelight. I make do with firelight on camping trips. But in some situations candles are perfect. And this is one of them. I'm glad you had a couple of tapers in your cupboard. Me too. Well, here's your stuff. I don't know if you want to get dressed here or I'll take it into the bedroom. Right. You like privacy. I do. Go ahead and pour the wine. I'll be right back. He picked up the duffel and carried it into her bedroom. Then he came back out and scooped up his clothes lying by the front door. If you have a plastic bag, I'll stick these in my duffel. Sure. Hang on. She set down the wine bottle and popped into the kitchen. Soon she was back with a plastic grocery sack. I don't have many of these. Take my own bags to the store. I'm with you on that. She smiled as if that meant a lot to her. Glad to hear it. He dumped everything in the bag, but on an impulse pulled out the shirt. Good thing I didn't lose this. It's my favorite t-shirt. Yeah? I hate to admit I didn't notice your shirt this morning. Let me see. She took it and held it by the shoulders. Wow, nice. I found it several years ago on a trip to Idaho. The t-shirt was black, imprinted with an image of wolves sitting around a campfire. Underneath was lettered The Gathering. I can guess why it's your favorite. It's a pack. She was right, of course, but until now, he hadn't understood why he'd been so drawn to the graphic on this shirt, other than the obvious: it was wolves and fire, both of which he liked. You may live like a lone wolf, but that's not who you are, she said gently. You need a family. Guess so. Embarrassed by the catch in his voice, he covered it with a laugh. Damn, we're letting the food get cold. You know how I hate that. Be right back. Turning quickly, he walked into her bedroom. He didn't realize until he got there that he'd been in such a hurry to escape his own emotional reaction that he'd left her holding the shirt. She understood him in a way that no one ever had. Naturally, he'd had guilty fantasies about building a life with her. Now she'd unearthed his deepest desire, one he hadn't admitted to himself until now. He longed to create a mighty werewolf pack in the heart of Alaska, where the legend had begun, and she was the one he pictured by his side. There was only one problem with that dream. She wasn't. Chapter 21. Even without the doomed pan of rice, the meal was incredible. Rachel gazed at Jake over the rim of her wineglass. You're one hell of a cook. Yeah, if you ignore the rice disaster that set off your smoke alarm. She waved that aside. Things happen. It's hard to concentrate on your rice. When long-lost members of the hunter pack show up, you probably need to call them. I told them you would. I should. He didn't look eager to grab his phone. They seemed nice enough, Jake. And they were close friends of your parents. Right. Yes. It might be really great to talk about your folks with someone who knew them back when. The hunters probably have some good stories you haven't heard. Maybe. In fact, I'm sure they do. He poured himself more wine and started to give her some too. That's okay. She placed her hand over her glass. I'm not as big as you and I don't want anything to interfere with. She started to say our last night. She thought it probably would be. But she decided not to put that into words, which would depress both of them. Our fun and games, she said, finishing on a positive note. Jake set down his wine glass. In that case, maybe I'll leave this for later. Heat flared in his eyes. Afterward. Jake, you need to make that call. Right. With a sigh, he pushed back his chair and stood. If you don't mind, I'll take my phone out on the deck in case they want to talk longer than a couple of minutes. There's nothing more annoying than being subjected to someone's one-sided phone conversation. True. She didn't say what she really felt, that listening to him interact with his own kind would be fascinating. She didn't want him to think she was a voyeur peeking into the intimate life of his species. Yet when he took his phone outside, she felt excluded. She didn't like being reminded that she wasn't a part of his world, but in fact she wasn't. Not only that, he didn't want her to be. Truth time here. She could rave on all day about her willingness to adjust to his culture, but he hadn't asked her to do that. Instead, he constantly emphasized his opposition to bringing her into the werewolf community. She didn't shut up about it, she would start to sound pathetic like a werewolf groupie. Gathering the dishes, she carried them into the kitchen and loaded them in the dishwasher. She wasn't much of a cook, but she was an excellent busser. Within 10 minutes she had the food put away, the kitchen sparkling, and the dishwasher running. Inching her living room window blind aside, she was able to see Jake pacing her deck while he talked on his phone. He didn't look particularly relaxed. Having the hunter show up seemed to have put him on edge. She got that. Living up here far from her parents, she was used to being her own person. She'd moved to Alaska partly for that reason, to establish herself as an individual. Jake's motivations for leaving Idaho seemed very similar to hers for leaving California. But now Idaho had come to him, and that sense of freedom might be slipping away. She certainly experienced that whenever her parents came to visit, much as she loved them. With nothing more to do, she walked into her bedroom. His duffel bag sat on the floor in a corner, but Duncan McDowell's book, which she'd taken without permission from his bedside table, lay on the bed. She hoped he wasn't upset that she'd tucked it into the duffel. Because she'd drawn all the blinds earlier in the day, the room was fairly dim, except for the light from her bedside lamp. Nudging off her shoes, she propped pillows against the headboard, picked up Duncan's book, and settled down to read. Several chapters later, Jake's voice broke her concentration. I can't let you keep that. He stood in the doorway, and the scene wasn't terribly different from the time he'd first caught her reading this book. Except they were in her bedroom and not his. His expression, though, was completely different. He looked at her with deep caring and more than a little concern. I know I can't have it, she said. But are you upset because I brought it over here? Not upset exactly. Worried maybe. Why are you worried? She wished he'd come over to the bed so they could be closer while having this conversation, but she wasn't willing to ask him to do that. He leaned against the doorframe. I don't want you to become fascinated with the work culture. That hit her wrong. Who was he to say what should fascinate her and what shouldn't? Too late. She heard the defiant tone of her voice but couldn't help it. I'm already fascinated. That's Duncan's gift. He has charisma, which is why he has so many female followers. And he makes the life of a werewolf appear to be a glamorous alternative to the ordinary existence of humans. That's not so difficult to do, Jake. I've discovered that urban wers glide through the city in chauffeured limos and have private jets at their disposal. Duncan describes a world of wealth and privilege. I'm beginning to wonder how many of my clients are werewolves. From what I know, quite a few. She stared at him. What do you mean from what you know? Have you been keeping tabs on me? I didn't tell you that? No, you did not. She was secretly thrilled that he'd been paying such close attention to her in her career. You built your reputation on your rendering of a certain wolf who looks quite a lot like me. Don't think the werewolf community hasn't noticed. You're kidding. Nope. Are you telling me they recognized you in my carvings? They did. Most humans think all wolves look alike, except maybe for some different coloring. But we don't, and a few wers are convinced that you're reproducing versions of me. She was stunned. Are Anne and Bruce Hunter convinced of that? They might be. We didn't get into that, fortunately. Push came to shove, I could point out that the wolf is actually my dad, not me. They'd probably take a closer look and agree since they knew him so well. But I have to be careful not to sound defensive, as if I have something to hide. And you didn't used to, but now you do. It seems so. She hated asking the next question, but she had to hear his answer. Do you? Regret knowing me then? No, his low, urgent response was all she needed. Pushing away from the doorframe, he came over to the bed. I'll never regret what we've had. Rachel. She noticed the past tense but didn't want to dwell on it. She gazed up at him. You had a nice long chat though. You must be happy to reconnect. She had a hunch about the telephone conversation, because his whole manner had changed in subtle ways. Yeah. He shoved his hands in the pockets of his jeans and glanced at her. The hunters aren't on vacation. They were sent by the pack as emissaries, because their past ties with my parents made them the werewolves with the best chance of convincing me. To do what? She scooted over and patted a spot beside her. Come sit with me. Don't be a stranger. Jake gave her a faint smile and sat down, angling his body to face her. Keegan Hunter, the pack alpha, has asked to be relieved of his duties. He forced himself to lead the pack because he was next in line, but he's a werewolf historian who loves his studies more than he loves the daily job of running the pack. He's done well, but he isn't happy. And they want you to take over. Her heart thudded as she saw all hope of a future with Jake disappear. Jake, that's a wonderful opportunity. I have to admit it sounds pretty good. It sounds perfect. She pushed aside her own grief so that she could be happy for him. He might love Alaska, but he loved the idea of his own pack too, and here was his chance to have that. He wouldn't have to start from scratch. The pack would be in place, and although Idaho wasn't Alaska, it had its own rugged beauty. Anyway, that's why Ann and Bruce are here. Jake met her gaze. They didn't like the idea of presenting such a major proposition over the phone, but after meeting you, they had a sense of urgency. Because I might be a threat to their plan? He nodded. I'm not a threat, Jake. I would never stand in your way. You know I wouldn't. I told them that, but they're hardwired to be suspicious of all humans. But as long as they don't know that I know, we're good, right? Right. Rachel told herself not to buy trouble, but she couldn't seem to keep herself from asking the question. Let's say that they somehow did find out that I know. Would they have me killed? No, of course not. But if they think I might destroy the entire werewolf community, why wouldn't they? Because, as I keep trying to tell you, we're peaceful. We don't kill people. We don't even kill the traitors within our ranks, and we had one last year. She swallowed. So there was a system of punishment. If you didn't kill him, what did you do with him? He'll be in prison for a long, long time. So I wouldn't be killed. I'd just be thrown in a dungeon deep under some castle, chained to the wall, and fed maggot-infested bread once a day. Good Lord. Jake shook his head. You and Lionel come up with the most incredible doomsday scenarios. First of all, no one's going to find out you know anything, but even if they did, you wouldn't end up in a dungeon. Okay. Look, you'll be fine, but if someone suspected that you knew about us, I would never let anything happen to you. That's easy to say, Jake, but if you take this offer, you'll be in Idaho. He gazed at her silently for several seconds. Doesn't matter. I would still know if you're in trouble. I'd sense it. She drew in a sharp breath. That meant more to her than he would ever realize. He'd acknowledged the soul-deep link between them. But soul-deep link aside, he'd still be in Idaho. Even if you sensed something was wrong, you couldn't get to me in time. I appreciate the sentiment more than I can say, but I don't see how you can protect me from Idaho. Of course I can. How? Are you going to send your personal bodyguards? Because that's not how I live, Jake. I don't even like the alarms I had installed. Secret agent type. Werewolves with sunglasses, buzz haircuts, narrow black ties, and little curly wires hanging behind their ears would freak me out. He stroked her hair back from her face and smiled at her. You are so adorable. Don't patronize me. I mean it. I'm not sending bodyguards, but even if I did, they wouldn't look like that. Way too obvious. I don't care if they look like Betty White. I need my creative space. Realize that makes it harder to keep me safe, which is why I'm wondering how you would do it. You're assuming any of this will be necessary, which it won't. But okay, if you want to play worst case scenario, if it comes out that you have knowledge of us, then I will guarantee to the work community that you're completely trustworthy. And the powers that be will just accept that? Yep. Is your word that powerful? He shrugged. It's pretty powerful, but I'd also put up everything I own as collateral. Well, and they'd have me. So you'd never have to worry. Oh. She let out a breath. Then I guess it's a good thing that nobody knows. What I know. Yes, it is. But what a nightmare if they found out. Everything he owned, and even Jake himself, would be held hostage to guarantee that she'd keep her mouth shut. She'd always known the stakes were high, but this laid it out for her in detail. You don't have to worry, Jake. I will never let you down. I know that. He gazed at her tenderly as he combed his fingers through her hair. Not even under torture. At least I hope not. I've never been tortured, so I might crack right away. Fortunately, I can't imagine why anyone would torture you, so I think we're okay there. But wow, you do have quite an imagination. So you say, but it took me several days to figure out you were a werewolf. But you did figure it out. I should have realized you would, with the way your brain works. She studied him. You know how in the cop shows it often turns out that the criminal really wants to be caught? I guess. I don't watch much TV. Me either, but I've picked up on that common thread. Anyway, my point is that you secretly wanted me to find out about you. No, he frowned. No, I definitely didn't. Are you sure? Search your heart, Jake, and tell me you weren't hoping, even though you didn't want to admit it to yourself, that I'd break the code. He hesitated, a reluctant smile on his lips. Okay, maybe. I'll give you a maybe. That's not easy to confess, but if I'd really wanted to eliminate the temptation of you, I could have moved away from here 3 years ago, or any time since then. Exactly. She took a deep breath. So, you'll become the hunter pack alpha. She forced herself to say that with enthusiasm. She was feeling a little better about all of it. His gentle touch had soothed the turbulent emotions rolling through her. That's the way it looks. And until you mentioned it, I wasn't aware that I wanted to lead a pack. The thought hadn't crossed my mind, even though something made me buy that t-shirt. I didn't analyze why I liked it so much. That insight came from you. Warmth glowed in his green eyes. Thank you for that. So it all falls into place. She was determined that he wouldn't know that. Her heart was breaking. Maybe that was my role, to make you aware of what you were missing in your life. Then when the opportunity came along, which it has, you can take it because you know it's the right decision. He lightly massaged her scalp. For me. But what about you, Rachel? Laying the book on the bedside table, she leaned forward and placed her hands on his broad shoulders. I come out smelling like a rose. I have a career. Because your father posed for a picture and you bought the first carving. Inspired by that picture. I don't have a single complaint. But that happened years ago. He cupped her face in his big hands and stroked her cheeks with his thumbs. Then I charged into your life uninvited and turned it upside down. I feel as if I'm leaving a mess. No, you aren't. You saved me from getting mauled by a bear. A bear attack could have ended my career and maybe my life. So there's another reason for me to be eternally grateful to you. I just want to make sure you're going to be okay. She squeezed his shoulders. Of course I'll be okay. Better than okay. She soldiered on because he was damn well not going to feel sorry for her. Your role wasn't that different, really. You allowed me to see what I was missing in my life. I did. You bet. Thanks to you. I'm planning to find a worthy partner to share my bed. I deserve that. And didn't that sound spunky and proactive? Damn straight. If it takes a while to come up with someone as wonderful as you, then so be it. At least I'm motivated to search him out. He was quiet for a moment as his gaze probed hers. Finally he sighed. Am I allowed to hate that idea? Knowing that he'd be jealous felt so good. Only if I'm allowed to hate. The thought of you hooking up with some perfect little werewolf who will give. His smile had a touch of sadness. Fair enough. He shook his head. That's another myth. I figured. Just thought I'd ask. Her chest felt tight, as if someone had shoved her into a straitjacket. So it's decided. You'll go to Idaho and become the hunter alpha. Yeah, I think it's the right thing to do. They need me. She recognized the powerful appeal of that. She needed him too, but she wasn't about to compete with an entire werewolf pack. How soon? They don't want to take any more time than necessary. I told them to give me until tomorrow to decide. But assuming I agree, which I'm planning to, they'd like me to pack up my truck in the morning and drive in tandem with them back to Idaho. The suddenness of that shocked her, but she worked hard to make sure he didn't notice. What about your cabin? I'll contact an agent first thing in the morning and sell it furnished. She wanted to cry. She'd sat on that sofa, eaten dinner at his patio table, made love in his bed. She couldn't imagine strangers moving into his place. Knowing he lived across the lake, even before they'd become lovers, had given her life a little extra shine. That was about to change, and she wasn't sure she could deal with it. She would though. If this was what Jake wanted, then she would send him on his way with a cheerful smile and a joyful heart. That was what you did when you